Who am I? I had an introduction here, and I'm just going to mention that currently I'm at something called the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at University of Pennsylvania, and we have this fantastic opportunity to give you a first look at the TIMBRO Sharing Economy Index, which has been constructed for way too long, and we're very, very happy to have it released here and now. So why do we care about the sharing economy is a question. Why do an index of the sharing economy? And I think the reason, or rather the case in point, is that we're here today to talk about the sharing economy. We're all interested in sharing economy, and for good reasons. The sharing economy is, as we saw, growing. It's also, if you're going to listen to anybody pitch a startup nowadays, it's Uber version on something so often, and for good reasons. So the sharing economy could also make a qualitative difference to the economic landscape that we're living in. There is a chance for it to reshape the economy. The previous speaker here on Karovidershi was mentioning that there might be less of a reason to own two cars. There might be less of a reason to own certain things. You might specialize on what you own and share that with your neighbors, and then borrow or rent rather what you need that you don't have. So with that kind of challenges, oh, here we go. So there we go. So with that kind of challenges, there might also be a different institutional environment that we'd like to have in order to have as much growth as possible, if this is one of the areas where we're going to have growth. And another thing is also, given this situation we're in right now with institutional framework and these new services, the institutional framework might be used differently. So it might force change without actually changing any laws. Now, what's the sharing economy index? I really don't see that. Okay, so I'm going to do it. So the sharing economy index is an index of the kind that we're used to from rankings. So it looks at the relative size of countries' sharing economies. And we're doing, oh, perfect, thank you. So we're doing that by using a composite indicator. And what I mean by that is that we have two different kinds of data that we are combining in order to use as much of the data that we possibly could that we've collected on this. And I'm going to talk more about the details of this today, and I'm going to start by looking at the definition of what is a sharing economy, because in order for us to have a ranking, we also need to know what we're measuring, and we will see that a lot of the previous efforts to do cross-country analysis actually has not taken this question seriously. Next, we're going to look at how we did construct the index, because that's kind of the story of what the data is, namely how we collected it and how it became the index that it is. And lastly, we're going to consider some first results with this data set when it comes to social trust as well as economic freedom, and how those things correlate or don't. So the first thing I said that I wanted to do is to look at the definitional aspect of it. So what is a sharing economy? And it's been mentioned by a previous speaker here that it's hard to define, and it might be changing over time and so forth. But if you're measuring something, you don't want it to be changing over time. So we're setting down a definition of what the sharing economy is. And we're not the first people to do that, but there is a plethora of various definitions. And we're trying to take the common parts of those definitions, as well as making it operationalizable, which means that we could actually look at organizations out there and determine whether they are or not, and don't rely on any kind of intent of theirs that we can't have access to. So a sharing economy, I'm going to read through this and point out some things because this is an important part of it. And this is a data set sort of presentation. This might come across as very, very narrow, but it's the important part to understand what we've done and what this means and how you can think about it. Okay, so a sharing economy service is a platform that facilitates agreement between identifiable suppliers of marketable services and identifiable customers demanding said services. Now, identifiable is the keyword here. So sharing economy is necessarily, according to us, a face-to-face sort of interaction. And you could say that, well, you might not actually know who you're interacting with in the sense of, I don't know how he or she looks, or even if it's a he or she. But the important thing here is that we're having a persistent identity. So there is a reputation that can be built up, and that identity doesn't necessarily be given to you to resolve the identity, to know who that person is on your street. Next up, the transaction may not involve any transfer of ownership and is conducted on a case-by-case basis where neither party is bound to engage in future transactions. Now, there's two things I want to unpack here, and the first one is that no ownership is allowed to be transferred, which means that so in the US we have a service called Craigslist where you buy and sell used goods. So in this case, that wouldn't be a sharing economy service, and according to some, that has previously been classified as one, but there is a big differences between the existing definitions. So this is the path that we chose to go. And that is conducted on a case-by-case basis. So that means that if you have something like a recruitment agency, that's not a sharing economy service, because what you're doing is that you're employing someone for a long time. But this is kind of on a case basis, a spot market of sorts. Next up, the sharing economy service activity must lower transaction costs beyond merely providing advertisement. So what we're trying to stress here is that there needs to be more than just providing basic matching. So again, if we're just having a classified on the wall and the provider of the putting up notes in order for you to share your sofa or whatever it might be, it's not providing a sharing economy service because it's merely advertisement. So what we want is someone providing as Karodershi that you had insurance or other kind of legal structure that are in place for you, or maybe a reputation system, something like that. Next, the sharing economy platform is distinct from the supplier and does not refine or significantly transform the supplier's input to the supplied service. So this is a little dense, but essentially what we mean is if you have a bakery, an artisanal bakery that buys flour from all the local farmers and then bakes bread, that's not a sharing economy platform, because the sharing economy platform needs to provide the product that was supplied and not make it into something else. So in this case, the bakery produces bread, which is very distinct from flour. Okay, lastly, and then we're done, I promise. Further, the suppliers must at least partially make use of excess capacity for the production inputs that combine to produce the final good or service listed. So in this case, we're stressing what's been referred to previously as the unlocking of idle capital. So that the fact that there was such a low rate of the rooms being rented out in I think it was Airbnb that we heard about earlier, could be that they're not very successful, but it might also be that they're only renting it out while they're gone. So the primary reason for them to have this accommodation is not to rent it out. They didn't invest on it in order to only make a buck, but actually live there or use it for some other purpose. So we include this for not having something like hotels.com being a sharing economy platform, because what they're doing is they're having suppliers, hotels, but those hotels were invested in with the sole purpose of running the business that we're looking at. So I think I went through that. Okay. So why should we care about this index? It's the first global index of its kind. It's a good reason to care about it. So we have, and the figure escapes me, but 230-ish countries in the index. Many of those are on the very, very lower end of the index, as we will see. And maybe even more importantly is that the index uses this exact definition that we can employ in order to know what we're counting. So we're not doing as previous indices typically have done, which is to go out on the street and ask how often or how many times in the last year have you used a sharing economy service. And a sharing economy service means a lot of different things to different people. And hence it's very hard to know what you're actually measuring. Is it the use of a cooperative living quarters, or is it Airbnb, or is it, could be a lot of different things. Now, so this exact definition of a sharing economy is something that we really want to stress is important with what we do. Now, we should also do this for a reason, that is that we want to promote some kind of knowledge to help policy, to help research, to further our knowledge of the topic. And what we can do with this, given that it's the relative size, is that we can create a ranking, and the ranking has value, and we will see more details about that. I'll save it. Other things we can do is run these regressions, right, and do more complicated analysis. So knowing what the effects are of this new economy on the old economy is one interesting aspect. The original question that took me and one of the co-authors on this, Andreas Berg. The other co-author is Joachim Wernberg. I should have mentioned from the beginning, but here we go. So trust. That's the reason why we started. Because this is an interesting question. I'll come back to that later. And the other thing is, what kind of institutional settings are the correct ones in order to facilitate the best situation for the sharing economy? And one good way of doing that is to compare country by country, and especially over time, to see what actually led to an increase growth, a healthy growth of the sharing economy. Okay, so here is the top 20. Slovakia is not on it, I'm sorry to say. Actually, Slovakia is terribly low on this ranking, and that doesn't mean as bad of a thing as we might or think, because all countries that are like lower than 100 are actually very closely close together, and the data quality for those that have very small sectors becomes worse. So the ranking where Slovakia is hard to say whether they actually are worse than Haiti, but you do rank worse than Haiti. So you're not doing very well in this ranking. I'm sorry. Countries that do, though, are countries such as Iceland, Malta, Croatia, typically very modern economies with a strong broadband penetration, and countries with a strong tourist sector. And it comes quite naturally, not least because Airbnb is the strong agent in our data sets. Airbnb is driving a lot of this. And especially in Iceland, there was a sudden, and it's kind of an interesting case that we spend a little extra time on in the report. So in Iceland, there was a sudden boom of tourism, and the tourism industry per se, it's hard to imagine how that could kind of reshape their landscape and reap the benefit of this. But since there was Airbnb, the amount of new beds available for tourism as that spiked was well there. Okay, so now we're getting to the part where we're going to try to understand what the data says by looking at how the data was collected. This is a three-step process. The first step is the one that I kind of alluded to when I talked about this definition. So it's a step of classification. So this is kind of an ambitious index, we would like to think. And this classificational process started with 4,651 services that we were going to consider whether they were sharing economy services or not. These services came from 5 different previous aggregators of services. And we heard previously about collaborative consumption, which we think of as a superset, like a larger bunch of things, and that the sharing economy is a subset of that. And we started with this big bunch of things. There were more than 5,000, 6,000 of them from the beginning, but a lot of the URLs, that is websites, were actually dead links because they weren't very well maintained, these lists. But we tried to get the biggest lists to start with. We also used Google and Wikipedia to try to search for sharing economy as translated by Wikipedia in various OECD countries. Turned out that that was almost unnecessary, but didn't lead to anything, which is a good thing and a bad thing. So we were afraid that OECD would be overrepresented because of this, but no reason to be afraid. Okay, right. So in order to do this classification, there was a special program being made to do this online using something called Upwork, where you can recruit people online to do work. And we recruited from 7 different countries, 12 people being trained via video chat and tested that they knew how to do this task and understood what the purpose was and what we were going for. And it turned out that 7%, only 7% of the collaborative consumption services were sharing economy services. So that's what we had to work with. So now we have this bunch of, I think it's 283 services that we're keen on understanding how large they are in various countries. So step 2, we used a automatic web scraping technique, which means that you purpose-built software that goes through the publicly available information on the suppliers that exist on the various platforms. So we did that, for instance, with Airbnb. So we know all the active suppliers on Airbnb, which turned out to be a lot. So it was 1.5 million of them during the sliding window of a week that we were looking at. And because we did this in a very a slow manner, where we're trying to be courteous, not affecting the normal process of the websites. Doing something like Airbnb takes several months to go through it in order to be sure not to affect their business, but still count them. The other, so that's one indicator, just counting the number of active suppliers on the services. And one interesting thing about that is we also get the geo coordinates of each of the service providers for that data set. So the geo coordinates means that we can go into any level of specificities. We could I don't know if you have municipalities in Slovakia, but we could compare different municipalities in Slovakia and see how they rank within these 21 services. The other interesting part we do is we use web traffic, because our sample size is clearly bigger than this 21. We had it 283, I think it was, yeah. So what we wanted to do is get data for all of them. And what we did was to use what is called a, clickstream type of data that we bought. Clickstream data is a service where you sell, you pay people to install an extension into their browser. That extension then follows what they do. So you can see what these people that are being paid for being surveillanced are doing. And it's an enormous business for them. So they have a lot of people all around the world. So we have data from 210 or something like that countries on this. And what we're looking then is how often do they go to the landing page of a sharing economy service. And there's a big caveat there, and that is that not all services are having an equally important landing page. So, for instance, mobile app-centric services such as Uber and Lyft is going to be gravely underrepresented in the data set, because you typically don't go to uber.com, you just use your app. But for everything else, it's working well, and thank you. And when we're doing the correlations, unless you think that there is good reasons to think that these are distributed very differently, the app-centric and web-centric, we can still use them to get good results when we're trying to find the determinants of this. Okay. And lastly, we do aggregations. We combine the two indicators. And we do that by normalizing them and then just choosing the mean, which has been previously used by corruption perception index. So I want to say something about these first studies that we've done. So I mentioned that we came to this through the question of trust. So the question we had from the beginning was, do the sharing economy require social trust? I mean, I think that it does when I'm thinking about it, because in order for me to let some stranger into my home, there needs to be some kind of mutual trust that this is going to be okay. But another argument is also that the sharing economy exists primarily because of the lack of trust. In order to bridge this gap, in order to find these insurance models, in order to find these ways of making a market where there wasn't one because of the lack of trust. So what's the most important? So in order to do that, we looked at this country-level index and we correlated it with what's called social trust, which is essentially a measure of the question, do you trust, I don't remember the exact way, but do you trust a unknown person on the street? Something of that sort. So it's a very basic measure, but it's been used since the 80s, and it's a well-known, well-studied thing, and we use that in order to look at this. And what we do find is that there's an extremely strong correlation with trust, as expected. But as soon as you start controlling for things, so in our first study, controlling for GDP was enough. In this data set, it's not true, but controlling for the broadband penetration just removes all significance. So we came up with the alternative hypothesis that it actually needs to be a lack of trust in order to have a sharing economy to this previous study. In this study, it's what we suggest because we can clearly say that from our data that the first hypothesis that you need trust seem not to be true. You need trust in order to have a flourishing society that has great bandwidth penetration. But as soon as you look at similar societies with similar bandwidth penetration, then the trust is not an important, significant aspect of it. So the second study, we're looking at economic freedom. And here there's a hypothesis that sharing economy is very different from traditional economy. Or so if you have that hypothesis, and a consequence of it, or a corollary of that hypothesis might be that there should be a negative correlation between economic freedom and the size of the sharing economy. Because if there's different institutional determinants for growth, we shouldn't expect the same. We do not find that, but instead find that there is no significance in having economic freedom as economic freedom of the world index, I should say, as a predictor. It is positive and definitely not negative, but it's not significant. But okay, so it's not significant, but it's positive. So what do we do with this? Well, the economic freedom of the world is actually also a composite index. It has 5 legs. So we look closer at 2 of those legs, which are legal integrity and regulatory freedom. So what we then ask ourselves is, so there's another hypothesis, and that is that the sharing economy is only here because we want to get away from regulations. We're trying to avoid regulations. We're trying to compete on other bases than vested interests. And if that was true, the hypothesis ought to be that we would have a negative correlation between these measures, namely that more regulation should also mean more sharing economy, because there's just more things to dodge. But we don't find that. To the contrary, we find that the same sort of legal integrity and regulatory freedom also help sharing economy grow as the traditional economy. Okay, so what happens from here? Well, this is something that we've done so far using what's called cross-sectional data, in that we're used to comparing countries, but we're doing this on an annual basis, and we will have panel data. We will see how various choices, institutional changes will affect the size of the sharing economy over time. And we hope that this data set will spur a lot of research, but also policy work in trying to understand the landscape of this new part of the economy. And as of now, this sharing economy database is constituted by the initial study, but we're going to have a collaboratively updated living database online where we would love to have Karaviderci added. And also for those companies that we're not allowed to scrape or that are app-centric, we'd love to find collaborative measures of including you in the data set by having some kind of collaborations on this in order to get even better data for the ranking and, more importantly, perhaps for doing the research with this data. And with that, I thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope that there is some interest in understanding or using this tool to understand the sharing economy further among us. Thank you.